there could be a war between India and China rather than China and Taiwan. There could be a war tomorrow because the troops are already there. And the way China could see this is that if there is a short war with India in which it's able to prevail, then it could significantly reduce support for Taiwan, at least in the region.
This is a conversation with Yusuf Unjhawala, a defense analyst from a leading Indian think tank, the Takshashila Institution. In this interview, I wanted to better understand India's foreign policy and security challenges, and how does India actually see the world from its own perspective. And so we talked about why India doesn't have allies, why it wants to be friends with both Russia and the West, or why a war between China and India might be more likely than a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. I hope you like it. And now, enjoy the conversation. Okay, so welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Dominic. Thanks so much. Great to be here.
I think most of my viewers, including myself, know that India is this increasingly important geopolitical actor. But just to speak for myself, I don't really know much about where the Indian foreign policy is coming from before we even get to talking about what does it look like today and what are its main goals, ambitions. I wanted to go back a little bit and give a little introduction on sort of the evolution of Indian foreign policy, where it came from and how did it get to the point where it is today under Prime Minister Modi. So if we could start by, talking a little bit about that.
Yeah, Dominic. India, as you might know, was colonized by the Brits, and for over 200 years they ruled over us. And we got independent in 1947. Our first PM was Jawaharlal Nehru, and he kind of gave the first a broad set of what India's foreign policy would look like. And perhaps it would be fair to say that in 75 years, some aspects of that foundation of foreign policy persists today. It has changed with times, but there are certain key aspects like how India maintains its, say, strategic autonomy, not aligning with anybody, pursuing its own interests. These are something which are standard going across the decades. A lot of our foreign policy shaped by our colonial past. We are very aligning ourselves with the goals of development and development of some of the other colonies which got independent. So this was how the foreign policy started, back in 1947, when we did not choose to take any sides between the US and the Soviet Union. We charted our own course. But obviously, there were certain moments in those periods which then influenced India's foreign policy. So if we just start, in 1962, we fought a war with China. Thereafter, in 1965, we fought a war with Pakistan. In 1971, we again fought a war with Pakistan, and this time it led to the independence of East Pakistan, which was known then, and it turned, it became an independent country called Bangladesh. And it was perhaps this war which kind of, made a shift in India's foreign policy, although we were non-aligned and we remained non-aligned thereafter. But there was a certain tilt towards the Soviet Union because in 1971, a treaty of friendship was signed between India and the Soviet Union. And during the 1971 war, the US was on the side of Pakistan, and it sent a carrier fleet, the USS Enterprise, that even till date, is fresh in the memories of Indians who still have doubts about, how U.S. Foreign policy is even till date. And although our relations with the U.S. have grown, that was kind of a key marker in how India's foreign policy, which was non-aligned between both the Cold War antagonists, to kind of a tilt towards the Russia with the Soviets, who also supplied a lot of our weapons over the decades, and that continues till date. Although it has reduced in the last decade or so with our imports from Russia. But the dependency that was created with all those supplies over the decades lasts till date. Well, we have to come back to 1991, actually, when the Cold War ended. And then there was a unipolar moment. And this is when India decided to, amend its relations with the US, although the 1990s were still tough moments in the India-US ties. where the US was, asking India to roll back its nuclear program. India refused to do that. It asked India to, roll back even its ballistic missile programs. India obviously refused to do that. In 1998, we conducted the nuclear test, which led to sanctions. In between that, in the whole of 1990s, there was this huge terror campaign by Pakistan against India, which led to a lot of loss of lives. And during that period, there was a little, not a little, but a firm, backing by the U.S. Administration with Pakistan, which kind of guided India's thought process at that time. And when we turned the century, this is where the ties, when the, which were the foundation of which were laid by the Clinton and Vajpayee administration, where there were talks between Jaswant Singh, the foreign minister of India, and Strobe Talbot of the US. And this carried forward into the next administration of George Bush. And this is where, the ties started to change. So this is very brief of a very long history, although it's just 6 decades, but there is a lot in there.
So, moving to today, what does India's foreign policy look like today? I think that in the West, most people tend to be kind of confused about it and don't really know where to place it exactly, because when we do hear about India, I would say it's either in the context of, oh, India is part of BRICS, ally of Russia, that's supporting economically by buying Russian oil. Russia often tries to make it seem like India is part of this sort of anti-Western alliance. And on the other hand, we sometimes tend to see it as, actually, India is this Western ally against China in the Indo-Pacific. But then again, that might also not be entirely accurate and entirely true. So what's your take on what's your best explanation of what India's foreign policy look like today?
India's foreign policy is pursuing its interests. That's India's foreign policy. India's foreign policy is to pursue partnership which help its development goal. India is a poor country, $2,500 per capita income, right? So this is our foreign policy priority, to pursue development partnerships. We don't see alliances. We don't like the word alliance. In fact, we don't like the word alliance. We prefer partnerships with Russia, because we have a long history with them, with its earlier form, which was the Soviet Union. It continues today because of so many, dependencies, a lot of defense cooperation, which happened in terms of joint partnership. They helped us with building our nuclear submarine, ballistic missile submarine, which we are operating as INS Orient now. They even leased us nuclear submarines, which helped us gain, vital knowledge on how to operate nuclear submarines. So this is the kind of cooperation which happened with the Soviet Union and then Russia. So it's not very easy to, break those linkages, especially when there is still a lot of dependency. 87% of Indian Armed Forces equipment is of Russian or Soviet origin, for which we require spares, ammunition. Oh, and we are locked in a conflict with China right now since 2020. There are over 450,000 troops which are on the border with China, with backed by massive equipment, everything, tanks, guns, howitzers, air defense system. There's total preparation. If there is any kind of, even an accident, it can lead to catastrophic results. So that's kind of mobilization that exists, and it has been so for the last 4 years. So there is a lot of dependency. India cannot take some of the positions that the West will ask it to, because we are going to be mindful of our own requirements, our own friendships of the past, but that does not mean that we are anti or pro anybody. Like I said, we are just pursuing our own interests. So we're not an ally of Russia. We are not an ally of the West. We are friends and partners with the West. We are friends and partners with Russia. And we see it perfectly fine. We can pursue both those partnerships without, touching the other side the wrong way.
I think that's an interesting difference, because it's quite different from how I think the West, but also Russia, tends to think that you're either with one side or the other. But the way you're talking about it, it sounds to me like India kind of wants to be friends with everyone.
Yes. So even one of the terms that we use is Vasudeva Kutumbakam, which is world is one family. And the other term that we're using in the last few years is Vishwamitra, which is friends of the world, right? Friend of the world. So these are the terms we use. We don't see international relations as in black and white or in binaries that you're either with us or against us. That's not how our foreign policy has been. We make our opinions clear. For instance, if you want to talk about the war in Ukraine, well, it's Prime Minister Modi who coined this phrase, which says today is not an era of war, which made it to a even a G20 summit declaration, which was hard to get. It was that India's bidding which finally saw an outcome of that summit. We have made that clear. We have said repeatedly in the United Nations that we are for following of the UN Charter, abiding by the UN Charter, sovereignty, territorial integrity. We have said that. But when it comes to imposing sanctions, when it comes to punishing someone, that is not how India works. That's not India's foreign policy. So we are not going to be with any kind of a sanctions regime. We don't think that sanctions are going to work at all. It hasn't, right? I mean, you're seeing it. Russia's war in Ukraine continues without any abatement. So this is how we are. But we will make our voices heard, even with the war in Israel and between Israel and Gaza, in Palestine and Gaza. India came out very strongly against the terror attack because India has suffered terror attacks over the years. We are one of the perhaps the most worst sufferers of terrorism in the hands of Pakistan over many decades. So we were immediately out there condemning the terror attack by Hamas. But then we have also said that international laws should be followed by all parties in the conduct of war, which is obviously a message to Israel that we would not like to see civilian casualties, and they have to conduct the war by the rules of international law. So this is how we are. I mean, we are not going to take sides. We will let our opinion be known, even and more in diplomatic terms, even if we have to express our displeasure. That's how even when Prime Minister Modi, this today is not an era of war, was told by Modi on to Putin directly. That's the first time he used that term. So we will say what we have to say, but we are not going to use punishment as a way of getting things done diplomatic, because India does not see crowding out on one side and people forming entire groups, blocks, and then singling out or isolating someone. That's not how we work. We don't see that can get favorable outcomes.
But would you say that, we've touched on a lot of different things, and it would be good to go through them one at a time. So to stick a bit longer with Russia, would you say that despite this approach of not choosing a side that you talked about, did the Russian decision to invade Ukraine, did that change the Russian-Indian relationship in any way? And one of the things that I can imagine is that perhaps even just on the in the terms of the India buying Russian arms and having this kind of supply dependency, perhaps India would be reconsidering that after seeing the performance of the Russian weapons in Ukraine, but also the fact that Russia now is unable to export its weapons in mass abroad because it has to use all of its domestic production in Ukraine.
Yes, it has started to impact already. Indian armed forces are not able to get the spares they need. There are more concerns than just that. And I think we'll also have to look at the Russia-China relationship, which deeply impacts India. So with this war in Ukraine, particularly this war in Ukraine, what has happened is with all the sanctions on Russia, its military industrial complex is not able to get the machinery that it used to get from the West, in Japan, Italy, and countries such as those who are making those machines to manufacture weapons. All that is now coming from China. Secondly, all the semiconductors exports have been stopped, but they may be getting it indirectly in some ways. Largely, that has stopped, and that makes Russia now more dependent on Chinese semiconductors. And all these are huge risks for India because China is an adversary of India, and we don't want any Chinese electronics in Russian equipment that would be operated by Indian armed forces because we don't know how that would then, what kind of vulnerabilities would be there. So we be very, very wary about that. Secondly, Russia's military industrial complex, depending on China for machines, for raw materials, would give China levers to use. If there was any conflict between India and China, they would be able to exercise some influence on Russia, which would prevent supply of spares, ammunition, and things like that. Although Russia is right now not in any condition to supply, India's requirement. In fact, if you see, India signed the S-400 deal a few years back, and it's delayed. It's delayed by at least 2 or 3 years now. The deliveries we ordered 5, we received 3, and I think a couple more are pending. And we hear that it's not going to be delivered till about 2026 or so. So these are the things which are already happening. India also is learning from what's happening in the war in terms of how Russian weapons have performed or not performed. But I think the way we also would learn is in terms of how it is utilized to training. I think the learnings would also be that the deficiencies of how Russia's whole approach went, some of the lapses on its part, its strategy. They're a conscript army. We are a professional army. Things are there. So there would be learning. I don't think we would be totally dismissing Russian weapons because we've been using them for a very long time. But we have evolved our own tactics, our own strategies on how to use them. Our logistics are there. One of the key reasons why Russian losses were so great, especially initial days of the war, is because its logistics was just not in place. So there are different factors, but overall, yes, we'll be very concerned because of Russia's now dependent on China after this war in Ukraine.
So I think it's quite interesting that on one hand, you've mentioned that India has this policy of trying to be friends with everyone. And at the same time, you've stated quite clearly that China is an adversary for India. So how does that go together? And where is this adversarial relationship actually coming from? If you can talk about it for people who don't know much about the dispute between China and India, and why would the two countries actually be adversaries?
We have to go back, just after independence in 1950s. China constructed a road which goes through India's territory. Now, you have to go back to the British rule where they demarcated the border. It's called the McMahon Line. And then with the invasion of China, invasion of Tibet by China, and, we did not share a border with China. We had a border with Tibet. China invaded Tibet and then started to expand its claims. And, expansion is as it is, it started pushing its claim lines further and further. There were opinions in India at that time, that this is an adversarial country and we need to take steps against it. But there were certain probably missteps in those times for various reasons. We were a newly independent country. Maybe we lacked the strategic foresight or variety of reasons. China was able to capture a lot of our territory. It still does. It's in occupation of Indian claimed territory till date. We fought a war in 1962 over those territories, and that set the tone. We did not have relations with China for a very long time till our Prime Minister in 1987 visited China, and that again was triggered by a standoff in the eastern part of India, and it's a standoff which India kind of won, right? And that pushed the Chinese to start to talk to us. And then there were agreements in the 1990s. There were 4 agreements overall, certain border mechanisms, confidence building measures, and all that got broken down in 2020 when China, in the midst of COVID, just started to get into Indian territory, occupy areas, and deny us our patrolling rights. And ultimately, on June 15th, it led to a bloody clash in which 20 Indian soldiers lost their lives, and an unknown number of Chinese soldiers. They say 4, but it's a lot more. But they lost their lives, and this was the first blood in India-China conflict since the 1960s. So the relation is adversarial. Not only that, it's also how China operates, right? For China, India is their biggest neighbor. and their biggest strategic rival going forward. India is a rising power. It's growing economically, and it's not something that China is kind of wired to accept, because they, if you go by their mentality, they would want all those who are on the periphery to submit to it, and accept it as a superior power. I mean, it's trying to do that even today with India. It's trying to get India to submit that it's the preeminent power in the region. And that's something that's just not going to happen. India is a big country. India is a very proud country. We are not going to accept that.
One thing maybe to dig into a little deeper is that you've mentioned the border dispute with China and the clashes that happened. That's in the Himalayan region of shared between China and India. Um, how serious is the tension around the border? We hear sometimes, or I hear sometimes, that there are these clashes. Um, if I'm not mistaken, there's some kind of an agreement that the soldiers from both sides are not allowed to wear firearms, so it's only meal weapons. How serious is the situation at the border now, and how serious is that there could be some kind of a risk of escalation of these border clashes into some kind of a bigger conflict?
There are 50,000 troops on either side, armed to the teeth, eyeball to eyeball, right? So the risk of conflict is there. It's real. It's being managed. The situation is described as stable by India. China wants India to just forget about what's happening on the border and move on with the larger bilateral relationship. And India has said that's not happening. Till the border is tense, there cannot be, business as usual. So the situation is tense because there are just so many troops out there. China is doing more and more of needling. It has expansive claims over Indian territory on the eastern side. It claims the entire state of Arunachal Pradesh, and it has renamed places in Arunachal Pradesh, in Chinese. It continues to intrude into areas, build roads, villages. It has built villages on the border, and it is backed by China's, laws which allow these border villages to be armed, and they can use those weapons. So while these border mechanisms are in place for soldiers, I mean, the Chinese have come up with these things where even their civilians can use arms. So the situation is tense, although it's stable. We have had several rounds of military level talks, but no political level talks. That has not happened. China refuses to acknowledge, that there is anything wrong on the border, and it's just unacceptable. So there is no starting point as to where you talk. So all the talks are at a military level, so kind of make sure that there is no escalation, there is no accidental, triggering of a war. But the situation is tense.
Do you think that the worsening of the relationship and the clashes in 2020 that you talked about, do you think that was a result of a strategy from the Chinese side, or was it more of an accidental thing that sort of got out of hands?
No, it's not accidental. So in 2017, there was another standoff between India and China, and this time it was on the eastern part, and actually it was in Bhutan, where China was building a road, and Indian troops moved in to stop that from happening. So China was building road in Bhutanese territory, and that particular part of Bhutan is very sensitive for India because it's it's its artillery range from Chicken's Neck, which is a very small strip of land which connects, kind of say, what you call mainland India to its eastern part, where we have our eastern states, 7 eastern states. So India moved in, and there was a standoff for 72 days, and China used all kind of threatening language, including teaching India a lesson like it did in 1962 war and things like that. So the war hysteria was up, but then that was resolved. That led to a couple of informal summits between Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping. The last of which was in 2019 October, and the clash happened they intruded into India in April. So the plan to intrude into India was already set while Xi Jinping was in India for the informal summit. I mean, that's from satellite imagery where we saw some preparations to, which gave the kind of the hint that these guys were already planning to move in. And they used COVID when, the whole world was reeling under it. And that's when China decided to move in under the garb of an exercise. Such movements are not accidental. China doesn't do things which is accidental. It's planned. They thought through this. The motivations, well, there are some who say that it's India's change of administrative how in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, where it split the state from Jammu and Kashmir to the Union Territory of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh. Ladakh, parts of Ladakh are in occupation by China, which is called Aksai Chin, and that's where the standoff is happening right now. So, and there India is building a lot of infrastructure because India's infrastructure in terms of road connectivity, etc., was woefully inadequate, and India has been building these roads, at a frenetic pace right now. So some say that something like that could have triggered. I don't think so, because nothing has changed on border. India's map remains the same. That's India's territorial claim. It could be strategic because India and the US have been getting closer and closer. The Quad, which was formed in 2000 or kind of reactivated in 2017, had started to take a more definitive shape in terms of what the four countries are going to do, and China does not like it. It has been very vocal in its criticism and said it does not like these small cliques, as it calls it. And one of the objectives probably is to get India away from any kind of an alliance with the US, any kind of partnership with the US, which will hurt China. So my understanding is that this could be, the strategic aims are what, guided China to, take those measures. India being the biggest country in this region and the most powerful military in the region after China, if China could get India to back down, to stand down, then it kind of wins the entire region because that will have a ripple effect on the entire region, which will say that, the fifth largest economy in the world, a very powerful military has succumbed to China. What chance do they stand? And that would kind of lead to a domino effect. These are probably the calculations in the mind of China. India has not, obviously. India is too big and too powerful a country in its own right to, and too proud a country to accept any kind of submission, and we will not do that. So we are standing up. There is criticism of how the government went about, taking on China in 2020, but we're holding forth. We are not going to submit.
The reason why I was asking whether it was accidental or not was because from Chinese perspective, the big priority in the region seems to be the U.S. influence or Taiwan and B, U.S. influence. And it would make sense to me if I was leader of China that I would try to get India on my side. But it seems like that this aggressive policy towards India is actually counterproductive, and it's doing the opposite. That instead of getting India to back down and get further from the US, it's actually making the opposite, and it's making India more wary and cautious of China and closer to the US out of necessity. Is that right?
Is that? I would think so. I mean, if you look that China has failed to achieve its political objectives, if those were the political objectives, to get India away from the US, to stop India from, claiming or standing up to China and asking it to restore status quo, which existed back in 2020, April of 2020. China has failed in that. There are 50,000 troops, eyeball to eyeball, with a lot of equipment out there, which can really turn ugly. So yes, China has failed. The other way to look at it is that China would continue to pressure India, and this has now perhaps gone into a war of nerves, brinkmanship, and see if at the end of it, it's still able to get India to back off, because India's challenges are economic. We want to grow. We don't want a war. So China is still applying a lot of pressure. It's a game of, how both sides can, sustain this. It's not just for India. If it's even for China, because they are deployed, 17, 18,000 feet up there. They are not used to it. India is. India has been permanently deployed in these regions for decades. We fought a war with Pakistan in those icy heights, 18,000 feet. We have troops deployed in the Siachen Glacier, which is the highest battleground in the world, where the temperatures are minus 40. So we know how to fight high altitude war. China does not. So it's taking a toll on them as well. A lot will not come out because of the way the country restricts information. So not a lot of that is known what kind of toll it's taking on its army, especially because it's a conscript army. Indians are professionals. They spend months on icy heights in deployments as they are rotated around. So we have a lot of experience fighting up there. So it's a game of who has the staying power. At what stage would one side or the other say, let's talk? Although we are talking at military to military level, that's just to keep the border stable and not get into a conflict. But there is no political exchange at all. There have been handshakes recently between Modi and Xi Jinping, but just that. There is nothing more happening. Nothing that shows us any kind of an indication that we are heading towards a resolution of the conflict, because China just refuses to accept that there is any conflict right now.
You've mentioned the experience of fighting Pakistan in regions like that, and I think that's another interesting angle to it because India and Pakistan naturally, obviously, have been um, adversaries for many decades, but increasingly it seems like China is trying to grow influence in Pakistan and get it on its side. But at the same time, Pakistan has also historically had quite close relationships with the US, which is now getting closer to India. So how does this all work?
China has been backing Pakistan for decades now. China was instrumental in proliferating nuclear weapons to Pakistan, not only nuclear weapons, but even the delivery system with the missiles. It continues till date. So in 2014, Xi Jinping launched CPEC, which is China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which was brought under this BRI. It's kind of the flagship program of BRI, and a lot of that passes or is in Indian territory, claimed by India but occupied by Pakistan. So we have Pakistan occupied Kashmir on one side, and in the same region we have China occupied Ladakh. And for years, India has feared, a two-front war where both China and Pakistan, start hostilities together, attacking in coordination. So this has been our fears for a long time. But China has been backing Pakistan, like you mentioned, during the Cold War. The US was firmly backing Pakistan. It was providing it weapons. It was giving it, it even winked at the proliferation which China did, and which helped Pakistan acquire nuclear weapons. So that's the history. China continues to remain Pakistan's principal backer now since the ties with the US have gone down. But the way Chinese are, there are no free lunches, and Pakistan is beginning to recognize that, and that's the reason why in the recent times it's tried to mend its fences with the U.S. because it wants loans, it won bailout from IMF. It has just got one, I think, recently about $1 billion, but its economy is in tatters. Inflation is high. It kind of becomes even more dependent on China. The Chinese have investments in a port called Gwadar, which India suspects will in the future be used as a naval base by China. And this will threaten not only just India, but the entire region, because Chinese presence over there would even threaten the US interests. So the US is still having some influence over Pakistan, but uh, China holds greater levers. And that is of concern.
So naturally, the key topic and a potential future bone of contention in the Indo-Pacific is Taiwan, and the issue of or the fact that the U.S. is preparing for a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan and its attempt to get it back under its control. And you wrote on Twitter recently um, that you expect India and Taiwan relations to move a lot closer because in reaction to, if I'm not mistaken, um, the Indian Prime Minister Modi has for the first time interacted with the Taiwanese president on Twitter, and that was seen as quite big news. So what is India's position, and how do you see the future of this relationship?
Uh, India sees relations with Taiwan, or it's my personal opinion and even say advocacy for India to pursue closer ties with Taiwan, because Taiwan is a manufacturing powerhouse, and India has been pursuing manufacturing in India, in terms of attracting investments in India for a long time now, because we have a huge population, we need to create those jobs, and we want to be the alternative to China as a source for manufactured goods. So Taiwan, in that aspect, can offer a lot to India, or we can gain a lot from Taiwan. Taiwan obviously has a very advanced, electronic industry, including especially semiconductors, which is something which India is even pursuing. We have Taiwanese companies like Foxconn, although they are tied up with Apple because Apple has invested in India. So we have Foxconn in India, which is manufacturing for Apple. So it's the economic side which can get these two countries together, and that could potentially bring strategic benefits for Taiwan in terms of getting India's backing in any kind of a conflict situation. If India has a vested interest in Taiwan's status quo, uh, which we are even today. We don't want any conflict in the region. We want status quo, but that would kind of get a firmer backing from India if India has a lot of investments from Taiwan. So this is how I see it. But as
What
of now, I don't think there is any Indian position on Taiwan in terms of what would happen in a conflict situation. However, very recently, Indian armed forces have been studying contingency options should any conflict break out in the region, especially because we have agreements with the US regarding providing logistics, ship repair facilities, and also, how India's own interests will be impacted. India is a huge consumer of semiconductors, and a lot of our trade goes through the South China Sea. Over 50% of our trade, or nearly 50% of our trade, goes through that. So we have a vested interest in keeping the oceans open and the region free from conflict.
Let me take a quick break here from the conversation to tell you about my Patreon. I do these interviews in my free time because I enjoy them, but if you want to help me make more of them, consider becoming a supporter. In return, you will be able to ask my future guests your questions, get Patreon-only episodes and bonus content, and watch all the interviews couple days early and without ads. You can go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics or use the link in the description to check it out. But whatever you do, thank you for watching. And now, back to the conversation. So, I think talking about China and going back to when we talked about Russia, um, one other thing that I think is quite important and that I'd like to talk about and understand is the issue of BRICS. This alliance that, as I've mentioned before, Russia in its propaganda aimed at its own audience and at Western audiences, it's often trying to make it seem like it's this anti-Western, anti-NATO alliance. And at the same time, India's there, but China is there as well. And that's despite the fact that they have this adversarial relationship. So how does India see BRICS, and why is it actually there, and how does it understand it? So how should we see India's position in BRICS and the role of this organization?
BRICS is not an alliance. It's a grouping, and it has been expanded very recently to include countries like UAE, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, and others. So it's not an alliance. It's a grouping, primarily economic. Well, I'm against BRICS. That's my position. But I think the way India sees it, it likes to be in different groupings so that it has more avenues to reach out to different countries, even if some of them are adversarial. I mean, India is an SCO, right? And that's a security grouping, and that was initiated by China and Russia. It includes Pakistan now, along with India. It on the face of it, it makes no sense, for India to be in that group. But if you look at it the other way, it works by consensus. So India being in there kind of prevents any kind of adversarial decisions in that grouping, which can go against India's interests. So perhaps I would see that as India in the Shanghai, the SCO, as a way to prevent any kind of adversarial decisions which are against India, and keep tabs of things and prevent any kind of consensus building within the grouping on certain issues. And if the West has any kind of concerns in that regard, then they would they must see it, in a positive way, that India being in the SCO will kind of be good for them in a manner where India is able to block any decisions which it sees are not in its interest and not in interest of some of its other friends. So that's about the SCO. But with BRICS, um, it's primarily economic. See what kind of cooperation can come out of it. With China, obviously, it makes no sense. But again, because it has so many of these other countries which are very good friends with India. In the UAE is our one of our largest export destinations. Not only that, entire Gulf region is home to, nearly 10 million of Indians, and who remit, tens of billions of dollars every year to families back home, which is very important for India. So, so India cannot be now, moving out of BRICS because all these friendly countries are there in it. So I don't think the West to see India's, presence in these groupings as kind of contradictory. India is going to pursue its own interests, but it's not going to be anti-West. So India is not going to take any anti-West or anti-US kind of a stance in any of it's because it's friends with even the US, it's friends with the Europeans, and we have a lot to gain from them because we are pursuing our own development goals. We want the investments from the US, from Europe. We want their technology. We want their capital. We want their manufacturing companies to come to India, just like how Apple is in India. And, it aims to export 25% of its global sales from India. And that's something that these are the kind of things India is pursuing. It can only come from the West, not from Russia or from China. So India is not going to take any kind of adversarial positions against the West. With China, we are adversaries. With Russia, we are friends. We are not going to take sides in any kind of a conflict. With Russia, or as we see with Russia over the Ukraine war. But with China, we have a very clear position.
And just getting back to the issue of Taiwan, you've mentioned that there is no clear defined strategy on what would India do in case China decides to invade Taiwan. But as you've mentioned yourself, I assume that India wouldn't want that to be happen because that would naturally hugely change the balance of power in the region and not in favor of India. Is there a chance that India could take some kind of a more active role in that and perhaps take advantage of the situation that there is this border dispute, and from Chinese perspective, China probably wouldn't want to have a conflict on two sides when it tries to if it would try to take Taiwan, it would put it in a very uncomfortable situation if the border dispute with India at the same time would get worse.
Yes, my fears, however, and I've written a piece about that, is there could be a war between India and China rather than China and Taiwan. China is not ready yet to invade Taiwan because the sheer number of ships, the logistics of it all, the 160 kilometers of water separating China and Taiwan is still a huge, it's a sea to climb, instead of using the term mountain to climb, but it has climbed the mountains in its conflict with India. And that's a real, and we are there already. There could be a war tomorrow because the troops are already there. And the way China could see this is that if there is a short war with India in which it's able to prevail, then it could significantly reduce support for Taiwan, at least in the region, where some of the countries which today show support for Taiwan, countries like Japan, Philippines, some of the Southeast Asians countries which would kind of stay mum, but they would then start to fear China, and then the first island chain has fallen, that kind of a thing situation. China could well use a war with India to achieve certain objectives in Taiwan, which is Taiwan could succumb, right? If China was able to today get into a war with India and achieve its objectives, then Taiwan would say that they would super peace, and that's how China might see this. And this is my fear, because there are so many troops out there. We don't know what is the thinking in the mind of Xi Jinping, but this is one of my fears, where it could use India as a way to win Taiwan. and a war with India as a way to get Taiwan.
What would that look like for China? Because I imagine that, India, as you've mentioned, um, has one of the largest militaries in the world. It's the most populous country in the world. It seems like for China, that's not an opponent that you would want to take on, because it's not an easy one to fight against.
So it would depend on what kind of war China chooses to fight. It would certainly be with a lot of cyber attacks where it's able to, or tries to take out, our infrastructure, power grids, our financial systems. By it has a huge range of missiles where it could launch, on key targets in India and not get into a kind of, close quarter combat where India would kind of be in an advantage. So, we don't know what kind of war China would like to fight or what is preparing to fight. It has deployed its J-20 stealth fighters very close to the border. So it is preparing. It perhaps can be part of, psychological warfare where it's trying to show the kind of deployments it's doing and see if India can back down. So that is also possible. But when you have so much military equipment, lethal military equipment, then there are chances of it being used. It can go up, especially if there is any kind of a trigger moment. So it depends on, how Xi Jinping is thinking. One of the key aspects to look into this is what about Xi Jinping's domestic situation? Now, that also can be a trigger point. The situation on Himalayan front is tense, stable but tense. It can spill into a conflict. Regarding Taiwan, I think India can use its relations with Taiwan to greater economic advantage. We see that way. And it's for Taiwan to kind of then invest in India and see if it can get strategic benefits out of it, like I said earlier.
I think my final question would be, um, whether you think that the new Indian government that has just been formed, whether that could change India's foreign policy in any way, and whether that could, how it might impact the future relationships with China. And also, as part of that question, maybe if you could speculate what kind of changes we might see in India's foreign policy in the next near term future. So let's say maybe next 5 years.
I think it will be continuity because the prime minister is the same. However, he's been forced into a coalition, but he has a fairly large number of seats in parliament. They have 240 out of 272, which is fairly large. It just needs a couple of allies who have supported the government. So it's a stable government. The PM has retained his primarily the cabinet, as in India, it's called the Cabinet Committee on Security, which is the finance minister, the home minister, the foreign minister, and the defense minister. They're all the same. So expect continuity. You may expect, certain moves in terms of trade with Taiwan. This is my expectation because it's India's need. And largely, there is not going to be a difference. It's going to be India doing what it has been doing, which is pursuing its interest. And you know what? India's foreign policy, like I said earlier, I mean, very, right in the beginning, it's a same thing in many ways for decades. There is continuity. We recognize in 1991 that it was time to reach out to the US. We did that, and it brought about a change in the mindset. It took at least 15 years of hard work till the time Prime Minister Modi went to the US for the first time and addressed the US Congress. Since they have been suffering from hesitancies of history, and he called on for those to be erased. And when he went there last year again and addressed the US Congress, he said, we have gone past those hesitancies of history, and there is a bright future for the two countries, and that future is now. This is how this has worked over 30 years since 1991 when the Soviet Union was dissolved and India started to reach out to the US. Then the next administration of Mr. Vajpayee, then the next administration of Mr. Manmohan Singh, in which we signed a nuclear deal with the US, which was the key deal that changed the India-US ties. That followed with the Defense Framework Agreement in 2005 for 10 years, following which India signed several defense deals with the US, which now is about $25 billion in the last 15, 20 years. So there is a lot of continuity overall. You may see certain, as India grows more economically powerful, it will pursue its interests even more vigorously. And then you might see certain, where it's strident in defense of its choices that it makes.